now.
Fine. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you happen to be. My name is Freddie Perlmutter, and I'm the co-chair of the Adult Education Committee at the Jewish Center here in Princeton, New Jersey, along with Moshe Margolin. We're very excited to present a new series called Adult Education Goes Global. And I'd like to thank the entire committee for their work on this series. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Adult Education Committee to the first program in that series, Hungarian Jewry Before, During, and After the Holocaust. In particular, we'd like to thank Neil Litt for all he has done to bring this program to us. In addition to being on the Adult Education Committee, Neil is a longtime member of the Havurah Minyan that meets every month on the second and fourth Shabbat morning, and he leads Talmud study here every Wednesday at 12:15. Neil will tell us more about today's program and introduce our speakers. Neil?
Thank you. In a moment of exuberance, I seem to have lost my notes, which is crazy, isn't it? Great way to start a program. Here they may be, yes. Sorry, all. Good morning, and I will say good morning because I'm not awake. Today's program will consist of a conversation between two survivors of the Hungarian Holocaust. They only met for the first time several weeks ago after accepting my invitation to participate in this program. And it's been my pleasure to see their relationship develop in this short time. Despite having lived only 300 meters from each other and attending the same school, their circumstances before and during the war were very different. Dr. Agnes Kaposi is an engineer. She was born to Jewish socialist parents in 1932. Her memoir, Yellow Star, Red Star, is underpinned by historical commentary describing her early years before the war, her experience in the camps, both in Hungary and in Austria, her post-war years under a Stalinist regime, and her immigration to the United Kingdom in 1957, where she continues to live to this day. Maritza Shelley was born in 1928 into a middle-class Jewish family. Along with her sister, she was sent to a slave labor camp. Later, they were joined by their mother. They were forced to march. The final destination would have been a concentration camp in Germany. It was Eichmann's death march. The three escaped before the march crossed the German border and were reunited with her father in Budapest, where they all lived under forged papers with the support of non-Jewish friends. Her father died right after Budapest was liberated. Maritza immigrated to the United States. Her sister and mother stayed in Hungary. Dr. Kaposi is an advocate for social justice, anti-prejudice, and equality. She continues to be active in numerous Jewish and secular human rights organizations, and she gives illustrated talks and seminars at various organizations, including universities and schools, addressing scholarly and public audiences, a testament to her passion for knowledge sharing and education. She's working with the USC Shoah Foundation as the sole interviewee in Hungarian for their AI project called Dimensions. She'll be addressing the British cabinet with her story on the Holocaust at their annual gathering in remembrance of the Holocaust in January 2021. Ms. Shelley is a member of the Speakers Bureau of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, consisting of Holocaust survivors. It was through them that she started to give her Holocaust testimony to schools, teachers, and different organizations. To facilitate the conversation, we have Dr. Laszlo Schertz as a senior archivist and historian at the National Archives of Hungary and Claims Conference University of Partnership in Holocaust Studies lecturer at the ELTE University in Budapest. He's the co-author of a co-author of
No,
with Gabor Kadar and Zoltan Vagi of the Holocaust in Hungary, Evolution of a Genocide.
Neil, you're muted.
Neil,
You're muted.
Was I
you're
muted?
unmuted now. Sorry.
Was I muted the whole time?
No, just when we got background noise, I did a broad scale mute. It wasn't supposed to capture you though, sorry.
Uh-huh.
Please
So what
continue.
was the last thing I said that was heard by other people?
Just a few seconds ago.
So had I begun introducing Dr.
Yes.
Schertz? Okay.
You had just begun.
Okay. So he's the senior archivist and historian at the National Archives of Hungary and claims Conference University Partnership in Holocaust Studies lecturer at the ELTE University of Budapest. He's the co-author of the Holocaust in Hungary, Evolution of a Genocide, along with Gabor Kadar and Zoltan Vagi. He's also the author of the historical commentary in Dr. Kaposi's memoir. We'll leave time for questions at the end. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll review them to consolidate duplications and pass them on to the panel. And that covers the preliminaries. Laszlo, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Once again, this is a great honor to be invited. Of course, the two magnificent ladies who are here with us, they are the main characters. I will be just briefly introducing this difficult topic for you. And let me share my screen. Please let me know if it's not visible. So let me start with a quote with the words of the towering Holocaust scholar Raoul Hilberg. Hungary was going to lift Auschwitz to the top, and that is how Auschwitz actually became a global icon and the most widely known universal symbol of genocide. Everybody knows the iconic images of the Auschwitz album, but few knows that those people arrived from a small Central European state. And many people, even those with some knowledge in history, think about the Holocaust as a project planned implemented by the Nazis and forced upon other European nations. But in fact, the truth is most of the Holocaust perpetrators were non-Germans, and the anti-Semitic and xenophobic traditions played a great role in each and every European country. And of course, Hungary was not an exception. Still, what makes this story, the Hungarian chapter, specific, it's very hard to summarize, but if we would like to use one phrase, it would be specific timing. In two respects, because the Hungarian Jewish communities were destroyed at the very end of the war, at the edge of survival, and also with unprecedented speed and efficiency. And despite the serious casualties and an increasingly hostile public mood, they lived relatively physically safe until March 1944. And that time they represented far the largest Jewish community in Hitler's Europe, because as you know very well, the Polish ghettos had already been liquidated by that time. And with the imminent defeat of Nazis, they had good reason to believe their sufferings would be end soon. But with the German occupation of Hungary in March 1944, the Nazis and their Hungarian henchmen launched an unprecedented blitzkrieg against them. And this blitzkrieg means that between May and July 1944, in nearly 8 weeks, close to 450,000 people were deported from the provinces to the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp complex, and you know the outcome very well, that because of the able-bodied Hungarian Jewish men were serving in the army, the majority of the deportees were elderly, sick women or children, and consequently about 3/4 of them were deemed unfit to work and therefore killed upon arrival. But despite this brutal efficiency, time and other factors worked against the Nazis and their accomplices, and they couldn't complete this terrible project. And therefore, even in extreme suffering, but the about 200,000 strong community in the capital city, Budapest, and also most of the Jewish men who performed slave labor for the Hungarian army survived the war. And therefore, specific gendered experiences is another unique feature of the Holocaust in Hungary, because this situation divided the community into 3 groups with very different experiences and chances for survival. And the memoirs we are talking about, and we will get some glimpse into today, provide us with an exceptional perspective, even within this very complex story. And as you will see, and you partly learned from Neil's introduction, Agnes was among the very few Hungarian Jewish children who was spared from the gas chambers in Auschwitz. And Marica, who stayed in Budapest, was among the last people being deported in Hitler's Europe and taken on a death march, and ultimately survived. And these are the thoughts I would like to start with, and then I would give the floor obviously to our guests and heroines of our conversation. But before we start, one more comment about the Hungarian Jewish story in general. Let me start with this. One of the most well-known stereotypes about Hungarian Jews is the widespread and genuine patriotism of the so-called Hungarians of Mosaic faith, as they were called, compared to Jews living in other Central and Eastern European countries. One of the indicators of this phenomenon was the large-scale Magyarization or Hungarianization of the Jewish names. And Marianna Farkas and Agnes Kaposi sound like very typical Hungarian names. But still, I wonder if your families had a Hungarian Jewish, or rather a Jewish Hungarian identity, or something else. What was your family's relation to Judaism and Hungary, and how did it change during the persecution? That would be my first question. And maybe I would give the floor first first to Maritza, if you don't mind, and then we switch roles. Please.
Yes. Oh, am I? You ready for my answer?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes, indeed. The Hungarian name, very Hungarian name, Farkas, was changed from Friedman, which was a German name indicating Jewishness in Hungary, and my first name was also Hungarian in a sense that they would not allow you to have a first name that's not registered with the Hungarians. So definitely my name, Marian Farkas, is a very typically Hungarian name. As far as our relationship to Hungary, indeed, we were Magyarized. That is, we had very strong feelings about Hungary. And I would probably say that I was Hungarian first and Jewish second. My family was not religious at all, but because the state and church were not separate in Hungary, I had to study religion in school, and from first grammar school on. And we studied Jewish history and Hebrew for many years. We also went to Friday night services. It was an all-girls school, so of course, conducting the services was the teacher who was male. Actually, we were really rather celebrated Christmas with a Christmas tree because it was beautiful and there were presents rather than Hanukkah. So, as I said, we were very Hungarian oriented and bemoaned the fact that Hungary lost so much of its territory after the First World War. We very much believed in what was the slogan saying, we want everything back. And that was one of Hitler's move to induce Hungary to fight on Hitler's side by giving back some of that territory. And I remember knitting shawls and gloves for the girls in those parts of Hungary that was returned to the country. So I felt very strongly about that. Anything further?
And
It's
first
not,
we can listen to Agnes, and then
Yeah.
I have more questions.
I was muted until a minute ago. The name at first, and then the attitude. My name, Kaposi, is of course that of my husband's family. And my father-in-law, like Marisa described herself, was a patriot. The family name was Klein originally. He changed the name. I don't know whether it was for patriotic reasons or for a notion that perhaps it would help a Jew to survive. I don't know what the motivation was, but he certainly was a patriot. And he was in the First World War, an officer of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he served in the regiment for the district of Kapos. And after his own regiment, he chose the name Kaposi. That's how the family name came about. I am, I think, 4 years younger than Marisa, and maybe the age difference, or 6 years younger, Laszlo says. That is a significant difference in age because it represents a difference in attitude. by the time I can remember, when I was still a preschool child, my earliest memories include anti-Jewish, vicious anti-Jewish posters, which appeared on the walls, in the newspapers, and so on. I think you have a slide. Those are two examples, but there are many others. There is another one, which is to my memory, which included the little phrase, "kill the Jew." These are among my earliest memories. I was never given a chance, even at the preschool age, to feel anything like patriotism towards Hungary. I was told I don't belong, and I learned that lesson. To this day, I don't feel any belonging, which makes it odd, because I like and speak the language. I'm told quite reasonably well. I know Hungarian poetry. I could quote some and love it. I love Hungarian folk music. So and my house is full of Hungarian national art. Now, that means I have a cultural affinity to a country of which I never felt a citizen. My attitude to Judaism is similarly ambivalent, because my family had no religion any more than Maritza's had. My father was a socialist, and instead of any kind of religion-based moral fiber, my family's attitude to the world was one towards social justice and equality for all, respect for everyone, work ethic, and such like. There was no room for anything particularly Jewish. Nevertheless, there was a sense of us belonging to a group. We felt loyal towards Jews and Judaism, and we would never have we would never have changed to another religion. Some Jews, whether they were religious Jews or not beforehand, became Christians and went to church. We thought this was distasteful. If you were a non-religious Jew before, why suddenly become a religious Christian? We could not understand that. We were not religiously inclined. So here I am, a Hungarian, a lover of Hungary culture, but not being Hungarian, and a Jew without religion. Thank you, Lars.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Sorry, it's slow to unmute myself. And I have to tell you that you were correct in mathematics, so correct myself. So the difference is, of course, 4 years between
I thought it was 4 years.
two ladies. And of course, it's also an interesting comparison, what you could see, what you could realize in that time, because Maritza, of course, 4 years older, could see and understand more things earlier than Agnes, obviously. And I wonder how you and your family experience the darkening political atmosphere in Hungary from the mid 1930s onwards, and how did you react to it, and also how your families were affected by the so-called anti-Jewish laws and other measures.
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
If you feel like answering, yes, please.
Sure. Well, my father's job was, he was a Hungarian representative of a very large German textile company. And of course, as soon as Hitler came to power in the 30s, he lost the job. Of course, no Jews could represent Germany. but he was a very clever businessman, and he was able to start a textile business in Hungary, and actually, as far as our wealth or non-wealth was concerned, we continued to live pretty much upper middle class life and very comfortable. So also, as far as how we responded, I was luckier probably than Agnes, because my class in the gymnasium, which was an elite high school, was the last one that accepted Jews without question. After my class, numerus clausus was installed, and the class after me had only 6 Jews, and so it went until no Jews were admitted to that school. But I was able to continue with my education. And somehow, because Hungary was fighting on German side, Hitler allowed the Hungarian regent, Horthy, to deal with the Hungarian Jews as he wished. Now, he was not a lover of Jews, but he definitely did not want to exterminate them. And therefore, until March 1944, when the Germans occupied Hungary, the Hungarian Jews were able to survive, more so, of course, than all the other European countries where Germany had occupied and already killed the Jews or had them in concentration camps. And that was particularly true in Budapest, where we could more or less live a fairly normal life. To demonstrate that, on that very Sunday, on March 1944, my sister and I and some friends went to an afternoon concert. We heard, I think it was Bach pieces. And when we came out of the concert, we discovered that something was very strange. Not only were there a lot of soldiers, but the soldiers were different. They were wearing swastikas on their helmets, and there was a lot of tanks also with swastikas. So we knew that there was something going on, and we rushed home. And true enough, we found out that the German occupation had happened, and that was the true beginning of the Hungarian Holocaust and genocide. But up until then, although there was anti-Semitism always in Hungary, we were able to survive and be able to live our lives. Well, I think, which is something I do tell the school children I talk to, the terrible mistake I've made, or we made, that we had no contact with non-Jewish. I had no non-Jewish friends through my whole education. And this started very young, in the playground in Budapest, during those times in the 30s. If a new kid came to the playground, the first question asked was, what's your religion? And if it was not the same religion, we just didn't play together, because we knew we won't be friends. It was not that we disliked each other. it was just a normal thing that we did not want. And this was a horrible mistake, because the Nazi propaganda was that Jews were an inferior race. Now, if a Jewish and non-Jewish kid became friends and they hung out together, they had secrets together, they had sleepovers, that propaganda would not have succeeded. So I always emphasize that when I talk to young people, that get to know the religions of other people.
Well, my story is different from Maritza's in almost every particular. My father can't have been all that much younger than Maritza's. He was born in 1901. He had absolutely no business sense. He was instead a born mathematician of exceptional gifts. He was a classics scholar by interest and by upbringing. And as a very young man, he was politicized. He became a passionate believer in fairness and justice and socialism. And before I was born, he was a founder and director of a support organization in my native city, Debrecen, which advised and helped the education of working people. And about a year after I was born, and radical right-wing government came to power, he was dismissed from his job. He was blacklisted as a dangerous socialist enemy of the political regime. And throughout my childhood, he was, to all practical purposes, unemployed. My mother was 11 years younger. My mother had younger sisters. My father had a younger brother. In my family, there was a whole plethora of young men, all professionals and all unemployed because of the anti-Jewish laws, very young new graduates. Here are three examples. My on the left, my father's brother, he was an artist. The man in the middle, my cousin's husband, he was a banker. My uncle on the right is a civil engineer. Now, they were all unemployed, as were other members of my extended family, men. And my mother, at the age of 22, suddenly found herself to be the sole breadwinner of the extended family. That meant, to all practical purposes, that I didn't know my mother. My uncles were my playmates, as Maritza indicated. It wasn't by choice. I was not allowed to be played with by the children of the district where I grew up, very close to Maritza's home in Budapest. Nobody was allowed to play with me because I was the Jewish girl. At school, the same school to which Maritza went, I was also the other for several reasons, either because I was Jewish or because any other Jewish girl that happened to be in the junior school was much richer. It was an area where families like Maritza's lived. These were people with, with factories of their own or successful businesses of their own. They had foreign-speaking nannies. They had servants at home. Their fathers were still in their businesses, employed or earning good monies. That they had, many of them, like Maritza herself, a home on one side of the river and a beautiful villa with a big garden on the other side, in the hilly side of Budapest, whereas we lived in one tiny room, jammed together, several families of my my unemployed uncles and myself. So I was either because of my religion or because of my social position, an outcast. Mine was not a miserable, lonely childhood, nevertheless, because my unemployed uncles and my unemployed father cherished me. I was the sole child in the big extended family. It was not a time where young men, although they might have been married, all my uncles, with one exception, were married. They didn't have children because they could not afford them. So I was everybody's little daughter. They taught me about their own professions. Before I went to school, I only understood something about double entry bookkeeping or understood about color coding of engineering drawings and so on from my uncles. Because of the way in which Hungary's role changed with the war, all of them all of a sudden disappeared in 1941 when the young men of Hungary were taken into the forced labor service of the Hungarian army. With one exception, all my young uncles perished. All three of these, whose pictures you see, they were killed. And many of them, because of the brutality of the Hungarians themselves, two of my uncles, the one in the middle and one on the right, under the unspeakable horrors of a place called Dorosic. So here is my childhood and the way in which my family, my extended family, was affected by the anti-Jewish regime. I was doing very well at school. I loved going to school. I went to the same school as Maritza, but as she described, by the time it was my turn to move from the junior to the senior section of the school, by then no Jews were admitted. And that describes my life up to 1944, when the Germans came to occupy Hungary. At that point, my Budapest branch of the family returned to our native Debrecen, where my grandmother still lived, and that is where our deportation history started. And that's how my childhood differs from Maritza's. I do agree with her observation in her memoir, nevertheless, where she says her childhood was taken away from her. My childhood was taken away from me as well.
Thank you so much. Of course, despite this close proximity in downtown Budapest, your fates made very different turns in 1944, as we have already explained. Leaving or staying in Budapest in 1944 was a question of life or death in many times, mostly because all the Jews from the provinces were deported, almost all of them to Auschwitz, as we know. And the Budapest Jews escaped deportation, but at the very end of the war, when the pro-Nazi autocrats came to power and the Soviets were approaching the city, they were dragged off for forced labor, and therefore Maritza was taken as well. So these are two different ways. But despite that, your stories of endurance and survival are still similar, and the similarity is the role of certain female heroes in your stories. Could you please elaborate and share your experiences?
Well, My hero, of course, is my mother. I always say that I had a sister 3 years older than I, that she gave us life twice, because if it had not been her, we would not have survived. First, we were taken to a slave labor camp where we had to dig ditches because closing Russian troops were trying to protect Budapest by having ditches so that the tanks could not approach. Well, we lived in, this was already November, and it was cold and rainy, and we lived outside of a brick factory between walls of drying bricks. And every morning we had to walk with our very heavy shovels and dig ditches that were about 6 or 7 feet deep and about 4 feet wide. Now, how useful they were, I spoke to a Russian tank driver after the war, and he said, well, we did come to these ditches and we got out of our tanks. We laughed for 5 minutes and then we crossed them. So the camp was very terrible and very difficult, and a lot of people perished. They had something called, where they would decimate the camp. Usually around 3 o'clock or so, we had to line up, and every 10th one was shot. So I won't elaborate on the life of that camp, but eventually I was separated from my sister and united with my mother. And at the point where we were on what was called eventually the Eichmann Death March. Of course, there were no cattle cars to take the Jews to Auschwitz or other camps, so we had to march. It was a horrendous march. It was not human. At that point in Hungary, mostly older people or very young people or sick people were left. The others were already either in slave labor camps or dead or in camps. But we had to march. If you stopped and you couldn't go any further and you sat down, that was the end. So my mother decided this can't go on. First, she was determined to find my sister. And every night we stopped at a marketplace or someplace overnight. She would go around looking for my sister, asking people if they'd seen her. She was exceptionally blonde, and she would describe her. And she did that every night until I think it was the 5th or 6th night that someone said, well, I think I saw someone like her, and pointed out where this person was. And true enough, it was my sister. And she was in very bad shape. She had, her feet were in terrible condition. She could not have walked much further. So my mother took care of that. She tore up some of her clothing and bandaged her feet, and we were able to help her walk. Now this walk was on the Budapest-Vienna highway. These were 50,000 Jews on the right side of the highway. It was a 4-lane highway going towards Germany, and with guards. with guns. On the other side of the highway, the two lanes were German and Hungarian military going east towards Budapest to fight the Russians. So it was a very busy highway. My mother decided that before we crossed the German border, we would have to escape. And we came to a spot that was a bridge over a dried out stream. And at that point, because there were so many groups and not enough guards, a guard was ahead of us with his back to us. And my mother said, now, and we grabbed my sister and jumped off the highway and hid underneath until our group had passed. Luckily, we had carried some clothing with us without any yellow star on it. So we eventually went up to the highway where there was a hiatus between the groups of Jews and started to walk to the next village. And no sooner did we do that, a Hungarian soldier came and faced us and said, who are you? What are you doing here? And my mother, without hesitation, said, we're coming from such and such a village where the Russians have already occupied, and we're running away from the Russians, and we know someone in this village, and they will help us. And the soldier said, oh, this village, I come from this village. Whom do you know? Who's your relative? And my mother, without, again, hesitation, said the most Hungarian and least Jewish name, the Kotish family. And the soldier said, oh, which one? The widow or Joseph? And my mother, of course, said the widow, hoping to have to deal with someone easier, with a woman. And then the soldier took us to their house. And we were very lucky that the mother, the widow, and the older children were out on the potato field. And we were able to convince the young girl to help us, not as Jews, of course, but the same story about running away from the Russians. And we told her we had to go to Budapest and we had no papers. We didn't realize all these Jews were were marching here. So we convinced her to give us her school paper, which of course, every piece of paper in Hungary had your religion on it. And so she said, well, go down to the highway and hitchhike. That's what everybody does. And she came down with us to the highway while he very proudly told us how she found some Jews trying to escape and how she turned them in and hoped that they were dead by now. Anyway, when we got to the highway, there was an SS soldier, an officer, hitchhiking. And she said, go ask him. And so my mother went up to him and said in her perfect German that we didn't realize that there were no buses or trains to Budapest. Could he help us? And the soldier, this officer, looked at us and kind of, by that time, of course, the groups of Jews were marching on the other side. He said, how do I know you're not Jewish? And my mother said, Jewish, look at my two blonde children. And that convinced him. And the German officer's bus came by and he stopped it and we all got on the bus together and taken to the outskirts of Budapest. So if it had not been for my mother, I'm sure that I would have stayed with my sister and we would have ended up in a concentration camp in Germany or Austria. And very few people came back from there. It wasn't Auschwitz, but anyway, it's my hero, of course, is my mother.
Now, it's my turn, and I would like to tell you something about the hero of my story, who is my grandmother. But before then, if I may respond to a question to the previous topic that we discussed, a question from Edna, and I'll be very brief about that. Edna's question is what relationship there might have been between the economic status of the Jews and their chances of survival, what characteristics assisted Jews in surviving. Well, as regards economic status of my family, as I mentioned before, and let me reinforce this, my family was characterizable by abject poverty, the kind of poverty that none of you, I think, are likely to have experienced. And this contrasted with my family's extraordinary intellectual ambition. It was an odd family in which on the one hand, there was great poverty. On the other hand, there was work ethic, a love of learning, absolute commitment to music. It's a very musical family. And two of my immediate family were trained musicians, and a very famous musician currently is also a family member. And other than, as I said, poverty on the one hand, intellectual interest and ambition on the other hand, family loyalty and social conscience with a firm work ethic. These were the characteristics. To what extent these assisted us in survival? I think the most important of these was the family loyalty and the way in which my family related to the rest of the community. These were important elements of survival. Now, regarding the women heroes, the greatest hero of my family by any account would have been my grandmother. She was a minuscule, tiny little lady, well under 5 foot in height, boundless energy, great physical, moral, and general sense. She had extraordinarily high standards for herself and for the rest of us, and she could always look ahead. And she prepared us, for example, in the ghetto, while everybody was bemoaning the circumstances in which we were. She was diligently trying to work the family towards some way of surviving. The building in the middle of your picture is the house in which her tiny little 2-roomed home was. The entrance, the left-hand side, you could see there was a gate to a famous street, Hatvanutca in Debrecen. All the little rectangles there show homes of different families, some Christians, some Jews. And Nanoka is the name I had for her. Nanoka's little tiny 2-roomed home was there on the left-hand side. There were 2 rooms and a kitchen. There was no bathroom in any of the homes. The toilet was outside, as you can see on the right. There was a wash house as well. In the house itself, in the kitchen, there was a water tap, but otherwise that was all, and 2 rooms. In those 2 rooms, when the ghettos were formed, in those 2 rooms were crowded together 13 members of my extended family, some of whose pictures you have seen before. Among these were a 2-year-old little cousin of mine and a 3-year-old little cousin. There were 3 grannies in the extended families, my grandmother, my step-grandmother, and the mother-in-law, one of my aunts. And that that was another small child. I nearly forgot him, because he and his mother were killed in the ghetto, even before the deportation. The remaining 11 members of the family were taken along this famous Hatvanutza when the ghetto was cleared to the brickyard. And from the brickyard, most of the Jews of Debrecen to Auschwitz, as you have heard many times. My own family was among those few fortunate people who were in fact traveling towards Auschwitz, and the train was diverted halfway along, and instead we fetched up in Austria. All of the family survived, the 11 members. All of us survived slave labor, great hardship. I think, at least for part of the reason, the sense of the link among us, the family loyalty, and our general relationship to the rest of the Jewish community, and on the other hand, through the wisdom and planning of my grandmother. He was the hero. I'll give you an example of the way she assisted us. While we were still in the ghetto, she put out from material available, in fact, the material came from deck chairs. She cut out and sewed rucksacks for us all. And these rucksacks were the ones in which we carried with us our bigger possessions that we could carry. There is a picture among the slides available where you can see Jews mounting trains, carrying great bundles on their shoulders, wrapped in bed sheets, what they wanted to carry with them, or suitcases. No, we didn't. We had rucksacks made by my grandmother, which made our hands free to carry our 2 little toddlers. We took turns to carry them on the various marches which we were subject to in course of our deportation ordeal. And without this provision made by my grandmother for us right there at the beginning in the ghetto, we would not have survived. There is no question. We would not have survived, or at least our little ones, our toddlers would not have survived the ordeal which came our way. She was the hero of our survival.
Thank you very much, and let me share screen just for a second to show you a photo connected to Maritza's story. This is the photo on the left is the only photograph which survived on the so-called death marches taken from Budapest to the western border. But then I would go on and ask you a bit about your post-war experiences, because the Holocaust in Hungary, of course, ended in 1945, but the sufferings of the former survivors unfortunately didn't. And you were among the many young survivors who re-entered the Hungarian society in the hope that the new system replacing the wartime authoritarian regime would give them chances, and there would be a good new beginning. But then history took a different turn, and it turned out that Maritza left Hungary in 1947, before the Iron Curtain came down, and Agnes did so in late 1956, right after the famous anti-Soviet uprising. And both of you left family members behind, and undoubtedly it was a difficult moment. But what were the choices of your family and your choices, and how did you come to this fateful decision? Could you please recall your feelings about it, perhaps?
Well, I think fairness requires that I start this story instead of Maritza have to be the groundbreaker every time. First, about what happened immediately after the war. Your question is covering at least two aspects. One was immediately what happened after the war, and then about our escape from Hungary at different times. Well, on the left, you see a picture of beautiful Budapest, except the famous chain bridge is down, together with most others. Maritza's book, as well as mine, describes dead horses lying on the streets, rats the sizes of cats everywhere, dead bodies. Well, we lost our home. We never regained our home while we were in our forced labor camp. The meager small home that used to be ours had been allocated to a bombed out family, together with all the possessions such as we had, and we never regained them. My father, when the war was over, was weighing 35 kilograms in weight. He was one of these skeletons, the likes of which you have seen in many pictures. My mother appeared reasonably well, but she was not. She injured her back. And soon after our arrival back in Hungary, she was crippled. Gradually, it came to be, she was unable to stand even. And for 2 years, she was a bedridden invalid. And that was because of injuries suffered in course of our forced labor in the slave camp in Austria. At last, she was operated on her spine. Later on, in her late 60s, she had to have a repeated operation. So there was, as I say, my father a walking skeleton, my mother an invalid, and I was 12 years old. And somehow, and we were homeless. How we tried to gain some kind of grip on life without anywhere to stay, without any livelihood, is described in some detail in my book. How were the Hungarians receiving us? As at best with indifference, but quite often with hostility. And there again, there will be my personal experience described. Not to emphasize only gloom and doom, when I was still 12 years old, it happened on the occasion of a Simchas Torah celebration, as it happens, that I met a 16-year-old young man whom I then 7 years later married. And there is a picture of him with me in front of you on the right-hand side. He became an engineer like me. It was his choice. It wasn't mine. I would have wanted to study physics, but we were trapped behind the Iron Curtain, and the choices about personal matters, about political convictions, about style of life, about every aspect of our life was made by the communist government, not by ourselves. So that is how I became an engineer. I must say it was a good choice by the communist dictatorship. I loved my profession. I wasn't an engineer for gadgets. I was more an engineer for theories and building of my own profession. Nevertheless, it allowed me in due course to make my way and make a career. We wanted to have a family. but we would never have had a family in a communist regime. When the anti-Soviet revolution came in 1956, it was about 4 or 5 months after my graduation. Some of the pictures in my book that you would see about that revolution were actually made by my husband. However, the revolution was, it didn't have a very long impact, because after a short period of hope, the revolution was beaten down and the communist regime re-established. But there was a window of opportunity which my husband and I grabbed, and we escaped from Hungary. The escape was not easy. We arrived in the West with precisely nothing. The clothes we stood up in. We did have a little bag that we started with, but we met up with a family whose need was so great that we abandoned our own possessions and instead we supported them. The family whom we helped consisted of a young woman, 8 months pregnant, a blind granny, a 2-year-old youngster, and a slender little husband. So there was my husband and I helping them to across the border, across the minefields and barbed wire and so on. Well, it took us 6 weeks from arriving in the West, finally to fetch up in the United Kingdom, which was our target. Again, the details of this are described in my book. It was, in my opinion, a good choice. It wasn't the place where 2 young engineers without business interests got any prospect of becoming rich. That was never our ambition. Our ambition was to create some kind of a life where we could have children. My first daughter was born within 2 years of us arriving in this country, and my second daughter 3 years later than that. My husband worked in industry and I in academia and in research, and we found the circumstances here tolerant. Never did I encounter any anti-Semitism or any discrimination because I was an immigrant. On the other hand, I had to fight strong prejudice against me as a working woman, and particularly as a woman, as a working engineer. My profession is not one where women were at that time often encountered, and even now, no more than 10% of women, graduate engineers are women. And among my experiences of being always the other is my experience of working in this country as a woman. But I made my way, and thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. And Maritza was one of the last ones who could leave Hungary formally, legally in 1947. But how were the circumstances?
Well, I just want to go back to Agnes's experience in 1956, because that was the time that most people who wanted to leave Hungary left. And I was safely and constant already in this country, but all my friends were still in Hungary, and they decided at 1956 to cross the border and leave. And they ended up in Vienna. And because they were political refugees, they would probably go almost to any country, but they were so tired of fighting and war and Holocaust and whatever they survived, they wanted as much peace in their life as possible. So while they were in Vienna, they bought all the newspapers from every country and all the capitals. And they said, whichever country has the most peaceful news in their news front page, that's the place that they would go. And sure enough, the Toronto Star had Johnny Prince Charles's haircut for 3 days on the headlines. And so they decided to go to Canada. And sure enough, they all ended up, all my friends in Toronto, and had a very happy and successful life. I just thought this is a fun story. As far as myself, I was brought up actually on American movies. Mostly nice old romantic movies. And my whole concept of America was one of, well, it was just so glorious and so rich and so easy and so beautiful. No anti-Semitism. I knew nothing really basically about this country except what I learned from the movies, and they were so terribly prejudiced. So after the war, I went back to school to finish and graduate. But after a few weeks, it just didn't make much sense to me. I couldn't concentrate on my Latin history and just everything was so separate from reality. So after a few weeks, I quit school also because my father died. I needed to get a job. And luckily I had a connection and I became a photography apprentice and at a studio. And I did all that was required to become a licensed photographer. And, but in the meantime, I kept thinking of the picture of America. And it just so happens that we have some relatives in New York and they decided to help me to get here. So I decided to leave my sister and mother and come to this country. My mother stayed because she felt too old to, although she really wasn't, to make that big change. Also, she said, well, I have a daughter in a communist country and one in a capitalist country. So what could be better? And my sister, who became a dancer and quite much, she had a good career as a dancer and mostly as a teacher. And one of the plays that she danced in was directed by her husband, who was not her husband yet, but that's how they met. And they got married and they both had very good careers in Hungary after the war. And they had no intention of leaving. So I said goodbye. I didn't realize that I will not see my mother for another 6 years. It took that long for me to get my citizenship, or later on when she was able to come to this country for her to get her papers. But I remember I had to leave and come to this country. I had to take a train to Prague because there were no airplanes from Hungary. And as I looked out the window of the train and my mother on the platform waving, and as the train was moving and she was getting big, little smaller and smaller, and finally disappeared, I knew I was going to be on my own. Luckily, I spoke English quite well, so I had no problem with the language when I got here. And eventually, not my first job, but eventually I did become a photographer. And then later on, also a photo retoucher. So, but it took a long time. I was very homesick for quite a while, mostly for people and places. But I was able to make friends fairly easily and settle in this country.
May I add something to the very beginning of Maritza's very interesting expose here? She said something about some people choosing the country where they went to when they left Hungary. Some of them choosing Canada for this reason, the United States for the other, because of Prince Charles's haircut, or because films they might have seen, American films. We had the idea of coming to this country, the United Kingdom, for a specific reason. And it had nothing to do with Prince Charles's haircut or any films. It had to do with my family's socialist background. I was brought up with the notion of liberal democracy and the trade union movement. And the home of Western liberal democracy, as far as my father's teaching of me went, the notion of such a country where this is put into operation as far as it is practically possible was the United Kingdom. And sure enough, there is liberal democracy here, maybe more than elsewhere. It's far from perfect. And currently we have a goon of a prime minister, a clown, which is a shame for us, and I wish it would be somebody else. Nevertheless, it's better than most others. As regards the trade union movement, it's one of my great disappointments. The British trade union movement is not what my father would have envisaged and I would have liked to see. Nevertheless, I still am very grateful to this country, and I am a loyal citizen, and I was not told that I didn't belong here. I am still learning this language. It's a beautiful language. My accent will never be taken to be any of the locals, but nobody has sent me back. Nobody wanted to kill me here. I am content. So much about why the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both of you. I would love to ask more questions, of course, and there are many interesting topics, but we ran out of time. We spared for the conversation, and I would like to ask I would like to open the floor for questions, perhaps. So please feel free to ask or write questions to the chat box, and Neil will help us to read them.
Laszlo, I don't think I'm sorry, I don't think we have time for that. There were two questions in the chat box, and one of them was addressed. But if you have any final thoughts before I just close things, please, this would be for you and Agnes and Maritza, but I promised to end this at 1:30. And I have a few closing things that are not related to this program, but are related to future programs. So any last words before we move along?
Well, only to say,
There are no questions to answer.
anyone who would be interested sending me any comments, observations about what happened today, or if any of you choose to read my book, if you have any comments or observations or questions, please let me know. I would be very, very pleased to receive them. Thank you.
Maritza, any closing thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure whether the audience got the picture of Jews in Hungary. They got a lot of our stories, but basically, unfortunately, Hungary right now is not in the best shape, and I'm worried about the growing anti-Semitism there now. I must say that when we got liberated, although life was very difficult, at least we Jews felt that we will be saved, that it's not going to be another Holocaust. And I do hope that that will be true.
Okay, thank you. I never expected we would get a portrait of all of the Jews in Hungary, but rather a portrait of the experiences that you can speak to, which is your lives. And I appreciate all three of you, Agnes, Maritza, Laszlo, for coming together for this informal conversation. I will cherish the memory of it for many years to come, God willing. And on behalf of the Adult Ed Committee of the Princeton Jewish Center, I'd also like to thank all of the attendants who came here today, and all the people on the Adult Ed Committee who put in a lot of work to make this thing work, both technically and in terms of the content of the program. The next program in the Adult Ed series will be next Sunday. It's at noon again. It's Professor Yael Reshef who will be speaking on the revival of Hebrew, the transformation of Hebrew from a language that was used mostly for liturgical and written purposes to a full-fledged national language. And you can see more information about that program on the Jewish Center website under Adult Education. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
And
Thank
happy
you, ladies.
holidays.
Thank you, Monica. And thank you, Neil. And
Thank you, Neil, for your
bye.
assistance. Bye-bye. Talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.